Chapter 19. Believers. "Don't be stupid," one of the men said, squinting over his rifle. Lindsey looked at Sabrina, who had stopped in the middle of reaching for her blaster. "Keep your hands way up. I'll only say it once." Sabrina reluctantly raised her hands over her head. The men were dressed in threadbare work pants and shirts, the sleeves removed for the sake of comfort. Their torsos and limbs were wrapped in belts and straps that held sheaths, holsters, and bullets. The distances they had crossed showed in the cracks in their boots and the dust in the creases of their skin. The largest man had 3 long knives strapped to his chest, in addition to the gun he aimed. His head nearly touched the ceiling. His shoulders were the height of the top of the door frame. The man in the middle wore glasses. He was smaller than the others, and Sabrina imagined him an easy target if she had to resort to hand-to-hand combat. The third man, not as tall as the first, was thick and wide. He wore a beard that reached his chest. His full-sized rifle seemed like a small toy in his scarred hands. Strapped to his thigh was a hatchet that Sabrina knew would be just as dangerous as a gun in close quarters. The turbines closed again, circling the cul-de-sac. The rafters and the floorboards vibrated, and the door they had entered shook in its frame.
"Give it another distraction,"
a fourth man said, appearing from another doorway. He was older than the rest, with thick silver hair that rolled in waves over a dark brown scalp. The man in the middle, his eyes obscured by the glare of light on his glasses, removed a small black palm tablet from his vest and began tapping and sliding his fingers across its screen in swift strokes. After one final decisive strike, he looked up to the ceiling as if he could see the Elved circling through it. He was different from the others. While they were somber, he wore a mischievous smile. It was clear he was enjoying himself. A second explosion sounded and the house rocked on its foundation. It was followed by a third, this one more distant. The Elved banked, accelerated, and was gone, receding in the direction of the noise.
"He'll stay busy trying to figure out where those came from,"
said Glasses as he replaced his palm screen. Lindsey and Sabrina waited in the silence that followed. The men appraised them. Sabrina could only imagine what a sight they were. Her ministry patrol suit, Lindsey's ill-fitting clothes, a belt made of rotted curtains, wild locks, and a bedraggled beach bag.
"Who are you and what are you doing here?"
Silverhair asked. "I am Lindsey Medina, of the Fortinbras Circle. This is my friend Sabrina Sabria. We're seeking refuge among the escaped believers."
"Not so much escaped as in hiding,"
the man with the knives said.
"We're all penned in by the walls."
Silverhair silenced him with a glare.
"Your friend wears a suit we don't like to see."
"She is a cadet."
"She can speak for herself, can't she?"
"I can."
"Are you a believer?"
Sabrina felt Lindsey's eyes on her. There was no use lying.
"No."
The men readjusted as they absorbed this information. Silverhair motioned with his chin, and the younger man in glasses knelt down in front of Sabrina. He had a handsome, rakish face that would have fit well in one of the clubs where they used to go to dance and flirt with boys. Sabrina wondered if she had seen him in a club before. There was something familiar about him.
"Don't try anything, cadet,"
he said, a blade of grass he was chewing on bouncing on his lips. First, he removed her blaster. He checked all her pockets, probing thoroughly, his touch light and restrained when it neared her breasts and thighs. He hummed as he studied the suit and mumbled under his breath.
"New model, eh?"
Sabrina nodded, surprised. He settled his attention on her belt buckle before tapping and removing the power source, as if he had done so 1,000,000 times before. Next, he asked for her arm, and in a few deft motions removed the grapple. He checked the visor last, his finger rubbing the stub where she had broken off the antenna.
"She's not traceable. At least not by conventional means,"
he said, stepping back to examine the grapple. Sabrina eyed it as if he had just removed one of her limbs. With the power source gone, she was just wearing a heavy, very flexible bodysuit.
"How many days have you been out?"
"This is our third," Lindsey answered.
"No signs of the rage?"
"The what?"
Lindsey asked. "Increased anger, aggression,"
said the young man in glasses who had examined Sabrina's suit.
Intense nightmares?
We've both had dreams, Lindsey said, looking at Sabrina. But nothing unusual.
Sprocket, examine them,
Silverhair said. The men had their rifles up to their shoulders again. Sprocket, as the one in the glasses was called, checked their pulses, respiration rates, even pulled down on their lids to examine the flesh around their eyes. He pronounced them safe, but the guns were not lowered.
If you had been properly vetted and prepared to find us, the elders in the circle would have informed you of the rage,
Silverhair said, his hand now resting on the handle of the pistol on his hip. The circle is gone, Lindsey explained. They captured everyone. 2 Elveds invaded a service. No one escaped. Sabrina broke into the detention facility to save me. Sabrina was grateful that Lindsey did not mention her role in rounding up the circle. We had to flee in a hurry. There was no preparation. For a moment the men lost their rigid composure and began asking after friends and family, rattling off names, some which Lindsey knew. She quickly answered if they had been in the service or not, or if she did not know at all. Silverhair brought them back to order. He had a powerful presence, and although not as tall as the giant with the knives strapped to him, or as muscular as the man with the scarred hands, he stood amid them like a captain on the deck of his ship.
There is nothing we can do now but pray,
he said, the blatant cult speak making Sabrina's skin crawl. Lindsey apologized for bringing such bad news, but by the shock of loss, her knowledge of the other circle members, or her natural charm, the 3 closest men had softened. Scarred Hands, who had said nothing, spoke up in a voice that was surprisingly high and gentle.
We are grateful you survived to be with us.
We are,
Silverhair repeated, the firmness in his voice unbroken.
But that does not solve the problem of having an unbeliever in our midst.
Sabrina lifted her chin, determined to show no fear as she waited for him to continue.
Where do your allegiances lie?
He asked. With her, Sabrina said, nodding to Lindsey.
How could you serve the ministry while knowing your best friend was a believer?
I didn't. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Lindsey bow her head, the motion not unnoticed by Silverhair. I didn't know until she was captured. Then she told me to go see what happened to prisoners.
Did you?
Yes. I saw it.
And
I could not let it happen to her. Silverhair nodded.
You are a foreigner among us, but you are welcome. You will find us more accepting than your masters within the ministry. We strive to be so, because at the core of our beliefs is love. You don't need to believe in all that we do, but clearly you believe in friendship and, I would venture, love. So if you love your friend and want to protect her, you will extend that protection to us.
I will protect my friend, Sabrina said cautiously. Silverhair smiled, the limitations of Sabrina's promise all too obvious.
No, that is not what I ask. I only ask this. Love her.
That I already do. His hand left the handle of his pistol, and he extended it to her.
Then we are safe.
His hand was calloused but warm, his smile wide and strikingly sincere.
You can call me Grange.
A 5th man lay unconscious in the front room. He was dressed like the others except that his holsters had been removed and placed on the floor in the corner. His body was long, his feet extending past the end of the sleeping mat beneath him. His thinning hair was dark and plastered against his flushed skin. Next to him rested a series of bowls holding water, moist cloths, tea, and finely mashed porridge. Grange explained that the man's name was Wills. A scorpion had stung him while they were on patrol, and they had been waiting while he recovered. Lindsey offered to help, mentioning that she was trained in first aid and, from her efforts to learn which plants made the best dyes, had picked up some knowledge of which had healing properties as well. Grange showed her a poultice he had made from milkweed in the garden. Lindsey praised his efforts and offered to make more, adding horse mint and barberry nut, which she had seen growing outside. Grange agreed. Sprocket accompanied Lindsey outside. Sabrina remained inside while the 2 other men played a board game on a piece of wood with a grid incised into it. Stones from the garden were their improvised game pieces. The house still contained the previous occupants' possessions. Sabrina noticed one interior room was impossible to enter, filled as it was with furniture, lamps, and other random household items. But the believers preferred the safe house to be austere and efficient. Grange had explained that they were part of a scouting contingent whose job was to monitor Elved patrols. They were a militarized branch of the believers, and Sabrina recognized the need for order and the avoidance of luxuries, lest they become too used to them and unused to the hardships that came with duty. Bran was the bearded man with the scarred hands, who, with his broad back and short stature, reminded Sabrina of a bear standing on 2 legs. When the game was over, he entertained himself by unfolding 6 soiled pages from one of his pockets and reading them intensely, whispering some words to himself, his fingers moving to an unheard beat. His face was placid and calm. Denalis, the giant with the knives strapped to his body, was Bran's opposite. He cursed, spat, and stomped, throwing one of the playing pieces into the corner where it ricocheted and clattered.
"I'll poison your food, I will,"
Denalis insisted, leaning across the board. Bran was unperturbed.
"That might actually improve the taste,"
he said softly, not taking his eyes from the sheets. Denalis sulked into the kitchen.
"At least I have decent tools to work with,"
he said over the sound of drawers and cupboards opening and closing. So not all conveniences were frowned upon, Sabrina noted with a smile, hoping they would at least eat well that night. They did. Although the rations of flat bread were hard and dry, Denalis prepared warm sauces from tomatoes, mint, and olives, with the perfect balance of spices. Lindsey licked her fingers and gushed.
"Oh, Denalis, this is amazing! Where did you learn to cook?"
"Home,"
he said before stuffing more flat bread into his mouth.
"Is that Fortinbras or Lysander?"
"Lysander,"
he said.
"Sabrina and I both applied to Lysander Academy, and we were both excited to live in a new city. Right, Sabrina?"
"Sure," Sabrina offered. Denalis stood up with a grunt and walked into the kitchen for seconds.
"My father taught there,"
he said over his shoulder.
"Oh, really? What did he teach?"
Lindsey said, brightening.
"I hated my father."
"Oh,"
Lindsey said, biting her bottom lip with her teeth. Bran stood up for seconds as well. Sprocket leaned in close to the women.
"Don't mind them. They're just worried about Wills."
"He'll pull through. Let the master be willing,"
Grange said from where he sat, cross-legged on a faded carpet.
"May he be willing,"
Lindsey quickly replied in what Sabrina guessed was proper cult speak. After dinner, Sabrina and Lindsey were given their own room. When Sabrina removed her suit, the stink was unbearable. Lindsey allowed her to use the bathtub first, their host providing buckets of well water. Sabrina's skin did not look like her own. Her skin carried impressions of the suit's mesh cross-hatching, and she bore black and purple bruises left by Pitt. In the mirror, she discovered gashes and scratches on her scalp, neck, and back. Her torso was still sensitive where the Elved had shocked her. Sabrina had no other clothes. So, once she finished her bath, she put the suit back on. When she came out of the bathroom, Lindsey was already asleep on her mat. Though the men had appeared to take Sabrina and Lindsey at their word, Sabrina still did not trust them. She rolled some blankets into a shape that in the dark she hoped they would take for her, set them on her sleeping mat, then settled herself up against the wall behind the door, determined to stand watch as long as she could before she roused Lindsey to take her place. A bang on the door woke her. For a moment she struggled to remember where she was. She was not sure how long she had slept. Any sleep had been too long. It was still pitch black outside, but she could tell that the blankets were pulled back from Lindsey's mat, and she was gone. The banging continued before the door finally swung open, and Bran entered, stepping on the blankets.
"Come on,"
he said, adjusting the strap of his gun on his shoulder, his voice thick, threatening.
"Where is Lindsey?"
"With the others."
"Let me see her."
Bran had already left the doorway.
"No time. Follow me."
She cursed herself for having let sleep overtake her. She stumbled through the darkened hallway after Bran.
"What is going on?"
Bran said nothing but pressed the back of his hand to his forehead as he waited by the door. He sniffed loudly before saying,
"You coming, or do I have to do this at gunpoint?"
"So much for love and trust." A chill raced over Sabrina's body. The pretense was gone. These men had never trusted them. They had simply waited until they had fallen asleep to separate them. She did not have her blaster, and she still had no idea where Lindsey was, or even if she was still alive. She decided to cooperate until she could learn more, or at least catch Bran unawares.
"We have to do this before it gets too light,"
Bran said, stepping through the door onto the deck and cocking his rifle. Sabrina followed obediently, the boards creaking under her feet. Outside, the air was cool. From the chatter of birds and the silence of insects, she could tell dawn was not far off. She searched the deck for something that might serve her as a weapon, her eyes falling on a clay pot. It was too far. Some of the deck's boards had become warped. She wondered how long it would take her to rip one up and swing it.
"Too long. Bran would shoot me before I freed it."
At the bottom of the stairs, 2 shovels leaned up against the house.
"Grab one,"
Bran said. Now she understood. They were making her dig her own grave. She lifted up the first shovel, testing its balance. The head was spaded and sharp. Bran grabbed the second shovel and told her to walk to the end of the row of houses. The silence of the men the night before made sense now. It was not mourning, but rather the sobriety, the guilt of executioners sharing their food and hospitality with their victims. Grange's entreaties about love were as false as the god they claimed to worship. All occultists had to be liars in order to conceal their beliefs. Her own best friend had lied to her, and she knew she had been a fool to trust these men.
"Lindsey, if they made you pay with your life, I will end theirs."
They reached the last house on the cul-de-sac. It sat on the edge of a ridge where the land dropped precipitously down into a wide, barren valley crisscrossed by dry wadi, the dry ravines winding between buttes of dark rock. The sky was just beginning to lighten in the west with the approaching sun. Bran kept his gun hanging at his side and scanned the sky. Either he was confident in his threat, or he was going along with a facade of trust, assuming she was too naive to understand what was happening. Both possibilities enraged her. She decided that she would kill him. He indicated that they should dig beneath a row of carob trees, where a number of small shrubs had taken root. She obeyed, digging slowly, conserving her energy and making an effort to create an impression of weakness. Bran's impatience was immediate. He began to dig beside her, the hole growing deeper and the pile beside it higher. He was powerful, the shoulders beneath his shirt wide and rounded, and his arms bulged thicker than Sabrina's thighs. The shovel seemed small in his hands, which were a size too large for even his body. The sun grew closer to the horizon. The blues and blacks of the night gave way to the greens of the garden, the white wall of the house, the earthen red of its shingled roof. Orhem had killed himself. This was different. Sabrina had never killed a man before, and she felt like some part of herself would be left in this garden too. Some part of her would come to an end. She assumed her doubts were just fear. So once Bran turned his back to throw a shovel of dirt onto the pile, before she lost her resolve, she heaved her shovel over her shoulder and swung it at the back of his head. She had braced herself for the impact, so when he ducked his head to catch his breath and the shovel blade passed over him, she flew off balance, careening into the side of the grave and causing dirt to collapse in a small avalanche on both of them. The tumbling dirt caught Bran's attention, and he turned and processed the shovel that had just missed him, and Sabrina holding the handle. She raised it again to strike, causing more of the pile to collapse. He turned his body towards her, his palms up, making no motion for the gun slung over his shoulder.
"So this is your story, officer. I didn't come to hurt anyone. But I'll kill you if you hurt Lindsey." "Lindsey? I told you, she's with Grange." "Digging her own grave? You tell me where." "What? No, they're with Willsbury," he said, somewhat incredulous. "Give me your gun." He slipped off the strap, checked the safety, then tossed it to the other side of the dirt pile. "Wills is dead," Bran said. "He died last night. Lindsey and Grange did everything they could to save him." Sabrina wanted to believe him. Bran shrugged. "Do it," he said. "Kill me. I'm ready to die."
Sabrina shook her head. She was sure this was just another cult speech, but then tears began to stream down Bran's face, tracing clear trails through the yellow dust on his cheeks.
Wills was my best friend, he said. He reached out to me after my son died. My wife had left me. All I did was drink illegal brew from distilleries and start fights. I saw enough of your kind in those days. Spent a lot of time in those detention cells in the station.
He wiped his face, smearing it with dirt.
I was one arrest away from rehabilitation. And you know what? I didn't care. It was Wills who brought me to my first meeting with believers.
He did not bother wiping his tears now. In a determined motion, he began gathering the stones and soil that had dropped down into the grave. He easily could have reached out for his rifle, but he didn't. Instead, he kept clawing at the dirt and throwing it over his shoulder.
He saved me. This is the last thing I will ever do for him. I don't know you. I don't know what you believe. Your friend says you aren't one of us, and I can tell it's true.
He stopped his digging and looked at the shovel poised over her shoulder and snorted a weak laugh.
But I'll say this, be it my last words. If you understand friendship and love, like Grange said, you'll understand why I don't mind sharing this grave with my friend.
He turned his face, indifferent to the blow she might deliver, and clawed at the earth with his hands, tears falling from his face like raindrops. Sabrina stood still, the shovel a ridiculous weight over her shoulder. She could hear footsteps coming from the direction of the house. Lindsey rounded the corner, followed by Sprocket, Denalius, and Grange, carrying Wills's body, wrapped in a white sheet. She threw the shovel to the side, stepped out of the grave, and ran into the empty street. Lindsey found her on the hillside. The sun was a hand's length from the horizon now, the rocky outcroppings in the valley casting long shadows. She cleared a spot in the sere grass and sat down next to her. "I was going to kill him if that's what you were about to ask," Sabrina said, her head resting on her arms folded across her knees.
"Why?"
"Because I woke up and you weren't there. Because you didn't tell me you were helping them."
"You never sleep. I wanted you to get the rest."
"I thought I was digging my own grave, Lindsey."
"Bran did not say what happened?"
"He's not a man of many words. I read his—"
She sighed and put her head in her hands.
"I read it wrong. I just see the world in a certain way. I see believers in a certain way."
Lindsey copied her, dropping her head between her knees, running her hands through her locks and giving them a vigorous shaking. The bells jingled. It was strange to hear something so familiar in a place so alien and forbidden.
"I'm sorry, Lindsey."
"A mistake averted. No harm done."
"Except to their trust of me, and possibly you."
"They are good men."
The men in question were still visible against the white wall of the house, heads bowed, hands held out before them, their palms turned upward as if waiting for something to be handed to them by a deity of generosity. It was like the gesture of surrender Bran had made in the grave. It looked ridiculous. To Sabrina, it epitomized the childish belief in some invisible higher being. She watched Grange remove a small text from his satchel and begin to read. Whatever the ritual, it was illegal. She sneered and looked away.
"When someone dies,"
Lindsey said,
"we don't need law. We don't reach for science. Gadgetry, technology do nothing for us."
She tugged on the edge of Sabrina's patrol suit.
"Ritual keeps the chaos at bay. We need soft words, spoken slowly, the same words over and over again. We need poetry We need music. We need songs we know from childhood. We need the thing just beyond the reach of those words that we can never have.
If you can never have it, why reach?
The reaching makes us better.
The reaching makes us empty.
Reaching fills us up. We already are empty.
Sabrina let out a loud sigh. It was all riddles and doublespeak cult nonsense to her. Grange continued to read while the men listened. Bran knelt down beside the grave, his head bowed so low that he risked tipping into the hole. He covered his eyes, his shoulders shaking. Sprocket placed his hand on his back.
Bran said Wills was his best friend,
Sabrina said, narrowing her eyes.
Said when his life was falling apart, Wills and the Circle, or whatever it is, saved him from himself.
It is what faith does. It gives us hope in a hopeless situation.
Seems to me Wills took advantage of a vulnerable, grieving man.
That is a cynic's view of faith.
It's a nightlight, Lindsey,
Sabrina said, throwing a rock down the hillside.
A nightlight for children afraid of the dark. I don't know why you don't see it.
Lindsey said nothing. While they waited for the ritual to end, Sabrina could not erase the image of Bran's face as he had begun to dig the grave with his bare hands. He had been unafraid, serene. She hated him for that. Chapter 20. Theopin. The men folded up their texts, gathered their weapons and packs, and marched south. They split up Wills's belongings between Sabrina and Lindsey. Sabrina had little trouble keeping up with her load, but Lindsey struggled. If the men felt any impatience, they did not betray it. A few times when Sprocket offered to carry Lindsey's load, she refused. Their path took them over steep hills with blistering hot stones and valleys with sweltering dead air. Sabrina was grateful for every tree and small patch of shade that they came across. The man kept a brisk pace in order to cover as much ground as possible before it grew too hot. Dark sweat stains spread out from beneath their packs, while their head coverings stuck to their necks. Around midday, they reached citrus orchards, overgrown vineyards, and groves of date trees. During the hottest point of the afternoon, they slept under rows of grapevines. By the end of the day, they were all carrying full bags of fresh provisions from the groves and vineyards they had passed. In the evening, they reached a pine forest, and the marching was easier. The air was cool under the boughs, and there were no thickets to cut through, no bushes to navigate around. Hidden from the sky, they relaxed, and there was more talking. The men asked questions about the city, and Lindsey asking how the believers survived in the wilderness, how they found food, how they created shelter that was not conspicuous to the Elfeds in their patrols.
Caves, Sprocket explained. Caves and orchards and vineyards, like the ones we saw today. The caves are invisible from the air. The area was once full of farms. We cultivate the remaining crops, but never so much that it is obvious. We try to keep the groves looking as if they're growing wild. It means scavenging to pretty distant food sources, but it's worked so far.
They set up camp in a dell where a number of large stones provided cover. Sprocket started a fire beneath an overhang using dry wood that gave off little smoke. Denalis was preparing dinner. He had the largest pack of them all, although it seemed the smallest against his wide shoulders and long back. He had filled it with cooking supplies, pots, pans, and a small bottle of olive oil. He hiked with a small pouch around his neck, and since morning, had filled it with herbs, roots, and spices. Denalis smiled as he upended it, and parsley, mint, ginger tumbled out.
One thing life has taught me about myself is that I'm good at killing people and cooking,
he said to Sabrina as he crushed the herbs between his palms into a pan coated with oil.
Don't worry, I prefer the latter, and almost never combine the two.
That's a relief, she said. For the second night in a row, they ate well. The main course was roasted tubers with ginger and sprigs of parsley and mint that Denalis arranged into little trees of garnish. They drank tea made from boiled pine needles that tasted like a forest breeze. The food cured the lethargy and sadness that had been hanging over the men since morning, and they spoke more openly. Or at least Sprocket, Denalius, and Bran did. Grange, after eating, settled himself into a nook between two boulders, unfolded a number of books from his bag, and lost himself in them, scratching out notations as he went. Lindsey kept the others engaged, asking them about themselves and their lives before they were believers, her magic with people no less effective here than anywhere, perhaps even more so with men starved for the company of women.
"Never was much good at books,"
Denalius said.
"Tried reading and studying in school, but the letters never stayed put for me. They just moved all around the page. My father, the professor, was all disappointed. I dropped out. Got into lots of scraps. Wanted to be an officer, but the reading thing was a problem, and, of course, by the time I was old enough to be a cadet, I had too many arrests for fighting. I was a security guard for a while, kept getting in fights with the boss. Guess I don't take well to authority. Grange says it's because of my relationship with my father."
"Do you agree?" Lindsey asked.
"Well, I tend not to disagree with Grange. He's usually right. I was a lot like Bran, on my way to getting reprogrammed, when this old woman, Miss Hinesward, known her since I was little, pulled me aside and said, 'You can't keep fighting them in the open like this. You have to fight them in the dark.' Well, I did not know what she meant. Still, she started reading these stories to me from a book she kept hidden in her panty drawer."
Sprocket laughed, but Denalius silenced him with a glare.
"Not Miss Hinesward. No jokes about her. She was smart. Who's going to check the panty drawer of an old lady?"
Sprocket conceded, and Denalius continued.
"I liked the stories. They stuck to my head better than vids I watched. After a while, she took me to one of the links of the Fortinbras Circle. They were a little surprised to see my type there, but they soon were asking me to join the resistance, saying they needed men like myself. I was all for giving a shank to the head ministry. So, here I am."
"So do you consider yourself a believer?" Lindsey asked. Denalius shifted, tossing some pine needles into the fire.
"Well, Grange and I talk about that a lot. I'm not all too sure what I believe in, to be certain. All I know is that these people, who are believers, they were kinder to me than anyone else. So I'm learning. I want to believe. I do."
The fire crackled. Lindsey looked to Bran, whose eyes were half closed, his hands folded on his chest. He unfolded them for a moment as he said,
"I believe. End of story."
Sprocket was next. His story spilled out more easily than the others. He was telling both of them, but his body was turned to Lindsey as he spoke. His father had been a machinist, building everything from computers and communicators to pedal cycles and cruisers.
But my father's favorite things were robots. He loved to bring together the intelligence of a computer with the physicality of a body. He was obsessed with it. Made him religious, and me too, without knowing it really. He was always wondering if the robots he made, were they like us? Were they more than the sum of their parts? When I was little, he'd ask me, "Is there a spirit amid the sprockets?"
"Is that where you got your name?"
Denalius asked.
"You never told us that before."
"We're all learning so much tonight," Bran said, surprising Sabrina. She had been sure he was asleep. "Amazing," Lindsey said, her eyes sparkling in the firelight.
"That's not even the most amazing bit,"
Denalius said.
"Go on, Sprocket. Tell her."
Sprocket fumbled over his next words and shifted uncomfortably.
"Now you're mocking me."
"I'd never do such,"
Denalius sniggered.
"Enough, boys,"
Grange said, his voice altered by the palm light he had cradled in his teeth while he read.
"Come on, Sprocket, tell her,"
Denalius urged.
"It's interesting."
Sprocket offered a silent assent, and Bran leaned forward into the light of the fire.
"It's the Elveds. Sprocket thinks his father invented them."
"What?" Lindsey asked, her head snapping around towards Sprocket.
"They have not been around since the founding," Sprocket said. "The old folk don't remember them. And I swear my father had schematics of them in his workshop.
His reluctance to share was gone.
Did you ever ask him?
Sabrina said. Sprocket shrugged. He disappeared when I was young. Not a few years after, boom, we have those things patrolling the skies. The lines and creases in his face had grown deeper, and he looked much older than he appeared. His hands absent-mindedly rubbed his knee, and he removed his glasses, seized with some sudden urge to polish them. "Where do you think he is?" Lindsey asked. "Holed up in a ministry building somewhere. Maybe they reprogrammed him once they got what they wanted. Or they just killed him. I don't know." "Have you looked?" "Don't want to. Afraid of what I would find. Couldn't bear to find him. His mind's scrambled. When I finished school, a lot of people told me I should apply to work at the head ministry's development wing. Some of my classmates got jobs there. People who were way dumber than me, but I got rejected the one time I applied. Don't think I could work for the bastards anyway. When my mother was dying, she told me she was a believer, and told me whom to seek out to find her circle link. The day we buried her, I decided to leave my share of the family business to my brother and join the underground. So here I am." Grange clicked off his own light and announced that it was time for all of them to get some rest. Breakfast was flatbread and oranges. Denalius had risen early to boil water. Grange had also risen early, though he ate separately from the rest, poring over his books and making more notes in his notebook. Sabrina's body was stiff from the previous day's trek. As she stretched, she tried moving close to Grange to see what was written in his books, but once she neared, he stood up and declared it was time for them to break camp. They walked in the pine forest for a few more hours until it gave way to more rolling hills. Ruins, some ancient, some more recent, dotted the slopes. The ancient ones were stone, and they looked picturesque among the haze and vineyards. The more recent were made of synthetic materials, low-density polymer and ethynyl acetates, stained and peeling from weather damage. They marred the landscape like plastic washed up on the seashore. Lindsey did her best to be friendly and charming, but Sabrina could detect a strain in her voice. She was trying to make up for Sabrina's mistake with Bran. When Sabrina woke, Lindsey was already gathering wood to help Denalius start a fire. For the second day in a row, she offered to bear more than she could comfortably carry and rebuffed Sprocket's offers to help, even as the pack left deep red welts on her shoulders. Sabrina wondered if Lindsey's efforts were necessary. The men had been generous with their food, and by turns were becoming more casual, even jocular with them, sharing jokes, mild insults, and taking time to catch up on gossip from the Fortinbras circle, especially Denalius and Sprocket, who always seemed to march near Lindsey. She was always eager with responses and a ready laugh, timed perfectly to the gratification of the storyteller. She had a knack for keeping a conversation going and enticing people to share their secrets. On the other hand, a conversation often died with Sabrina after a few exchanges. Sabrina and Bran traveled in a comfortable silence. They said little, but each could understand when the other was tired, needed water, a hand to clamber over a tree trunk or up a riverbank. She surprised him with her strength as she helped pull him over a tree fallen across their path. That night, while he took his turn building a campfire, Bran sang, his sweet tenor rising up to blend with the rustle of leaves and the whisper of grasses. The melody was strange to Sabrina, as if created on a scale she did not recognize, but was beautiful nonetheless. The others listened and ate in reverent silence. Even Grange leaned back and closed his books in order to listen. When Bran finished, Sabrina complimented his voice. "Thanks," he said. He had not shared his story with Lindsey when she had asked, and volunteered nothing in the subsequent days. Being a person of few words herself, Sabrina could appreciate it. He had told his secrets standing in Wills's grave, and for some reason he was still keeping hers. The other showed no sign of knowing she had tried to kill him. In the late afternoon, Sprocket called out for them to take cover. The roar of the Elved reached them just after, trailing on his words. They were all poorly concealed on the road winding along a ridge. Grange motioned for them to hide in the tall grass on the shoulder. It was imperfect cover, but the best they could do. Grange was near Sabrina, and freed some of the grass she had collapsed upon so that it would hang over and cover her. It was busy with leaping insects and redolent with the odor of pollen. Sprocket did the same for Lindsey. In a few moments, the band had disappeared from view. Except Sprocket. As the sound neared, his head slowly crept up, grass blades and seed pods stuck in his hair.
"Right, as if you have not seen enough by this point!"
Denalius cursed from some unseen place. His words did nothing to deter Sprocket, who dialed the aperture controls on his camera. When the engine sound was so loud that it drowned out even the noise of their panting, the Elved shot into view between the feathery heads of grass. The profile and configuration were undeniably avian, nearly perfect in their restraint and functionality. The brilliance of the sun slid up its side, pulsing with the contours of its carapace and dazzling their vision. The machine angled upwards and banked to the south, the pitch of the turbines changing. It turned to the next valley, tipping as gently and expertly as a bird. Its blue flames glowed at them like watching eyes before they faded over the next ridge. "Beautiful," Sprocket said as the sound of birds and crickets returned. "Beautiful." It was a day of ruins. They passed a number of ancient structures, cracked domes, toppled towers, and lonesome walls covered in moss and ivy. Sabrina preferred these to the decay of the more recent buildings. In those, the sense of loss and rot was as real and recent as bodies left on the roadside. The stone ruins, on the other hand, brought to mind paintings she had seen in her school tablets. The paintings had been lost in the cataclysm, but some images remained and were stored in the Ministry of Education's data cores. She had enlarged them on her screens many times to admire the sunlight slanting through high windows, or the novelty of trees growing between walls, their branches touching crumbling rafters. Her favorites were those where spires and archways loomed out of thick mist, hints of grandeur lost to time. Lindsey had never liked the pictures. She said they were too sad. Looking back, Sabrina understood better now. But she had always loved the haunted, dreamlike quality that each picture held. Throughout the day, they encountered scenes like those of the paintings. Pillars lay fallen across boneyards like slain sentinels. Here and there, Sabrina glimpsed between ivy stone latticework carved so intricately that it resembled lace. These buildings would have been old before the cataclysm. She knew they were religious structures, even though signs of which sects they had belonged to had been removed. Grange explained that the Elveds had done most of the damage. Many of the structures had been used until the cataclysm, but after the transition, when the walls had gone up around their land and the populations moved into Fortinbras and Lysander, the Elveds had systematically scoured the countryside for such buildings and rained fire down upon them, according to Grange. He looked sad as he said it, as if mourning the loss of sacred places, but Sabrina preferred the buildings this way, ruined, inert, harmless. Another structure, much larger than the small ones they had encountered, covered most of the hillside on the far side of the valley. It was so large that Sabrina had taken its sheer walls for cliffs. As they neared it, she realized it was a fortress. With its slanting brown walls, round towers, and parapets, it looked like the sandcastle she and Lindsey had made on the beach. That night felt like a lifetime ago. She looked to Lindsey to ask if she was thinking the same, but the words died in her mouth. The grandeur of the place had turned the party quiet. Sabrina decided it best not to disturb it. They camped in sight of the fortress, dropping their packs within another set of ruins. Statues with their own small shrines stood watch over a cemetery, the headstones disappearing in a field of wildflowers. The interior walls were decorated with small colored tiles. The windows had been shattered, but what bits of glass remained in the frames was also colored. The sight made Lindsey forlorn as she nudged the shards at their feet. It must have been so magnificent. The others were clearing dust, fallen roof tiles, and broken glass from the floor to make a space to rest. Grange decided it was best not to light a fire and risk a smoke column in the clear air. After a cold dinner of nuts, dates, bread, and olives, they arranged their packs as pillows. While sleep came quickly for most of the others, Sabrina remained on her back, watching clouds scud across a gap in the ceiling. A breeze swept up from the valley and made a whispering sound in the cypress trees that had grown up close to the walls. When she closed her eyes, she walked between stone tree trunks. Mist formed into faces, only to disperse and coalesce into a barrel vault over her head that was swept quickly away by the slipstream of an Elved. The machine perched on the edge of a shattered dome that sagged like a broken melon. The thrust from the purring turbines stirred leaves and rushes at her feet. She felt no heat. Instead, the breath was scented like pine sap and refreshing. The sound of screaming children replaced by wind whistling through cypress branches. The machine traced green lines on the floor, and Sabrina followed them to a dais. Between warped floorboards, she could see something bright and pastel pink. She pulled at the wood with her bare hands. The rotting boards gave easily, crumbling into pulp between her fingers. The green light fell upon a pink box. When she pulled it out and released the clasp, she found a chrome egg sitting on a bed of silvery paper. The paper rippled like water. The Elved's hydraulics squeaked and groaned, its talons readjusting on the crumbling stone. It concentrated its light into the box, causing the egg to shimmer. Sabrina held it out for the machine to see. Over its shoulder, she could see its brothers circling in a sky the color of bone. She woke to color. Bright hues spun and twinkled in her eye. As she moved her head, she realized the sun rising in the west was striking the remnants of a colored window. It had held a picture once. Sabrina could make out a turquoise field, an amber ray of sun, a snow-white foot, the edge of a purple robe. The rest was lost. A breeze stirred the tree branches that filled most of the window now. Shadows danced against the backside of the image, like the outline of something insubstantial desperate to break through. She had to urinate. Although it seemed late, the others were still sleeping. She tiptoed past their bodies. Lindsey was curled up, her arms wrapped around her pack, her locks trailing across her skin that looked ashen with a layer of road dust. A surge of protective feelings welled up within Sabrina. Outside, she threaded a narrow path between overgrown cypress trees and the building's uneven stone wall. Once she felt sufficiently hidden, she crouched down and sighed with relief.
"You are pissing on sacred ground,"
a voice said from above her. She jumped and nearly stepped in her own puddle.
"I should execute you for it."
As another breeze parted the branches above her head, Grange appeared, floating cross-legged among the boughs of cypress. She felt ridiculous and vulnerable with her trousers around her ankles.
"But this one time I will grant clemency,"
he said, turning away to preserve her modesty.
"When you are done, come up."
When she finished, she saw that he was perched on a segment of wall that had collapsed onto a tree that had been thick enough to bear its weight. Now the branches had grown up, providing cover for anyone perched at the top. Sabrina climbed the slanting face carefully, the stone grainy and cold to her touch. Grange's books were spread about him, their pages curled and stained with time and travel. His notebook rested on his knee. She settled down opposite him. The valley dropped away below them. With the sun in a new place in the sky, the distant fortress seemed to have changed character. It looked less menacing in this light, its angles softened, its towers less imposing. It posed like a benevolent overseer of the lands that circled it. Sabrina's attention came back to Grange's books. She could not read the writing, but she could read what he wrote in his notebook, his handwriting tiny and cramped, as if he meant to save as much paper as possible. The lines were perfectly straight, although not without crossed-out words, notes in the margins, and revisions.
"You are translating?" "Yes. I can read the old languages, the forbidden ones, the flowing characters, and the upright ones."
"Forbidden and illegal. A violation of codes 13 through 23, and numerous other statutes."
"I'm sure you could recite them all by memory."
He made another notation.
"I'm about to." "Don't waste your breath. Those words don't have the same power here."
Sabrina readjusted herself on the slanting stone face. "How did you learn?" He shrugged and smiled, lines radiating out from the corners of his eyes like sunbursts. He enjoyed flaunting the law in front of her.
I honestly don't know. My wife can read these.
He gestured to the blocky letters.
But not these,
he said, referencing the flowing ones. They were identical to the scrawls Sabrina had seen on Jacob and other scripts.
So, it falls to people like ourselves to translate what we have left of the sacred texts to share with this generation and the next.
And what do they tell you?
Many, many things which we don't even understand, and may not ever. We have lost so many texts and much context. It makes interpretation difficult.
And so you follow it, even if it does not make sense?
It may never make sense, but one must become comfortable with that. The closer one gets to the holy, the deeper the mystery grows.
Sabrina suppressed a sigh at the sound of more cult speak. It was all riddles and irrational rationalization to her. I thought you people wanted answers.
You are right. Some do. Some have no tolerance for ambiguity. Many are like that when they are immature, and at the beginning of things. And there are some answers here. How do I know these languages? Well, there are stories of people learning languages spontaneously in these texts, and perhaps I know from another life, and this indeed is not my first body.
You have to understand this sounds like nonsense to me.
As it did to me when I was in the city. But then I left. I took a leap of faith, and was rewarded. These languages emerged from within me, along with memories. Memories of a different life.
A different life? Where? Grange rubbed his hands together, a flush rising in his cheeks.
Well, it will sound like more nonsense, but I can remember another life in Fortinbras, before the cataclysm, I believe. When the city was called something else.
What was its name?
I can't remember.
His grin became sheepish, apologetic. It's impossible, Sabrina said.
I know how it sounds, but I am not alone. Many of us who leave come to remember things. Bits and pieces. Fragments. We can never seem to string them together completely, but there is no shaking some knowledge of something. Before.
Sabrina bit her lip and thought about Dr. Tripp, the young man who had given her a tour when she was posing at Zandy's. Dag had killed her parents, but she had not the least memory of them or their deaths. Was she too young, or had she too been manipulated? All she had ever known was the head ministry growing up. Had she had a life before that had been erased? When she did not say anything, Grange sighed.
I know how it sounds. But many of us wonder if there is something different about Fortinbras and Lysander. Because it is when we leave.
Things change.
Yes. At least it is so for those of us over 40. The younger ones seem unaffected. But we become a muddle. It is hard to tell which are our real memories, and which are something from another lifetime.
Sabrina cast her eyes out over the valley, but she barely noticed it now. A different vision was working through her mind, a gray-haired woman, thrashing about in the back of the prisoner transport. Grange? What is the rage? Grange grimaced and made a sighing sound. He closed his books one by one and stacked them at the top of the wall behind him.
It is the last thing we teach those about to set forth for the refugee encampment.
His whole countenance had changed, his mouth and even the corners of his eyes sagging downward in a frown.
Most people are able to leave the cities without any ill effect, but a few, maybe 1 in 50, lose their mind. They fly into such an inhuman rage, with inhuman strength and aggression.
His voice trailed off, and he did not begin again until Sabrina lowered her head to meet his downcast face.
There is nothing that can be done. Each and every pilgrim sets out with supplies that include a suicide pill or a knife. One to take if you feel the symptoms are coming on. Anxiety, anger, aggression. One to defend yourself if your companion falls ill. I'm sorry. That sounds terrible. It is. My friend who left with me and my wife. He did not make the whole journey. You should feel fortunate that you and Lindsey will.
I would not have known what to do if she had succumbed.
Well, the text's here,
he said, patting the closed pile of books.
They tell us that the followers of the sword live with it and die with it. So we are called to be worshippers and warriors.
And these men?
They are both. They fancy themselves more the latter, but I sense they are becoming more the former, as many of us are.
Many, but not all? Sabrina asked.
Not all. Many call for a more forceful uprising. You will see later this morning. There are 2 camps.
Lindsey has hinted at that before. And how do your texts guide you regarding force?
Ah. Well, it seems that one can find almost anything to justify their position in these, he said, shaking his head. The words contradict from one chapter, one book, to the next. Even the character of the master seems fickle. In one chapter, he advocates for love. In another, he smites a whole people. I came across a section this morning where he threatens to destroy an entire city, but one man strikes a bargain with him, that if there are at least 10 righteous men living in the city, it will be spared.
He shook his head and smiled wryly.
It's a muddle. It's why those of us who can are working so hard to translate all we have. The truth is there. We just need to find it.
But what if it's not? What if the final message is to live with a sword under your pillow, like you said? That would explain why all came to ruin before, and will again. Grange nodded and turned his face to the valley beneath them, taking in the land leading gracefully up through the purple haze to the sleeping fortress, the hedgerows standing out in stark contrast in the slanting sunlight, and the white clouds easing across the sky. The hues were as vivid as the colors Sabrina had seen in the broken window.
I just look at this, and I reflect on the entirety of beauty in the world. I think to myself that whoever created it could not be anything but a loving and peaceful being.
Sabrina nodded. After hiking with Lindsey and listening to her friend share her beliefs, the sentiment was familiar. I hope you are right.
If I'm not,
he said, collecting his books,
we'll take the good parts and live by them.
They were close to their destination, and Sabrina and Lindsey were blindfolded for the final hour. She knew when they had entered the caves, the sound of voices seemed to close in, the air grew still, damp and cold. Yet from what they could hear, the reception was warm. New voices called out greetings to the returning travelers, who were themselves grim, since they were returning without a comrade and had to share that news upon arrival. After a long descent, Sabrina sensed they were in a large chamber. Children's voices echoed off the walls and ceiling. Large fans whirred overhead, but did not disperse the smoky smell from cooking fires. Lindsey squeezed Sabrina's hand. From what Sabrina heard, she deduced that another group of refugees had arrived that same morning. Someone introduced them to Grange and the others as she and Lindsey listened. All of the newcomers were led onto some sort of stage where they waited, while the many residents of the refugee camp gathered below. She felt exposed and at a disadvantage. It was hard to tell who was sweating more, she or Lindsey. Their clasped hands were slick. When the blindfolds were finally removed, she was relieved to see that the people gathered below were not all staring at them. Instead, mothers were tending to their children, men were conversing, Teenaged girls bunched in tight knots were looking over their shoulders at bunches of boys who tried overly hard to ignore them. Sabrina was not sure what she expected of rebels eking out an existence in the desert, but they were reassuringly ordinary. Those believers who did meet their gaze smiled warmly. Lindsey took in the scene as well and smiled. She turned to their fellow newcomers and struck up a conversation. They knew some of the same people. Lindsey had even seen some of them the day of the raid. They were some of the lucky few who had escaped. Hugs, tears, and smiles followed. Meanwhile, Sabrina shrank into herself. Would they recognize her from that day as well? If nothing else, she knew her uniform was now attracting skeptical glares. A growing pack of heavily armed men who gathered to the left of the stage seemed especially menacing. These were the hard men, scarred, bearded, and cruel. In appearance, they were not unlike Grange and his men, but there was something wary and closed about them. These were the Elias Orhems. They conversed only with each other, and Sabrina did not like how their eyes kept falling on her and Lindsey. A hush fell over the crowd as it parted for a cluster of figures in robes. 3 men and 1 woman moved with deliberate swiftness towards the stage, the figure in the front bounding up the stairs first. He looked to be as many as 15 years older as Sabrina and Lindsey, maybe more, but it was difficult to tell, for he had a youthful face, and he moved with an adolescent's energy. He had a strong jaw and a high forehead, furrowed with the lines that spoke of reflection, laughter, and sympathy. His skin was smooth and glowing, not dusty and dry like the newcomers who had been exposed so long to the elements. His lips formed a smile or frown as needed. Only his eyes seemed old as he looked deep into the face of each newcomer, taking their hands in his as he expressed his welcome. When he came to one older woman, her hair plaited into white braids, he took her head in one hand and pulled her close to him. She shook in his arms while he whispered gently in her ear. Grange leaned near Sabrina and explained that her husband had been stricken by the rage on the journey outward. When they finally parted, the old woman's eyes glistened, but she smiled humbly up into the man's eyes. 2 of the other 3 who had followed him up the stairs had already melted away. Only a sour-looking man with a thin mouth and thick glasses that made his eyes look like large marbles kept close behind. A second in command? Sabrina wondered. As the leader came to Sabrina, he took in her suit briefly as he brushed a lock of hair from his forehead. When his hand moved away from his face, a smile was there for her. His hands were large and enclosed around hers. Up close, she could sense the largeness of his frame, the wideness of his shoulders, and the thickness of his upper arms. His grip was not gentle, but firm and powerful, as if to convey his control. In a melodious, deep voice that could carry over the heads of all the people if he wished it to, he said,
"Welcome to our home. I am Theopin."
Chapter 21. Trial. Sabrina could not will her mouth to move or make a sound. Theopin, his robes swaying like curtains about a statue, stepped to Lindsey, who exchanged some words of cult speak with him. Sabrina was unable to absorb what they said. She felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. A sense of vertigo made her dizzy as her mind tried to regain its equilibrium. Theopin will set us free. She could still smell the urine from the old man passed out in the alley beneath those words. They brought the same chill to her now as they did the day Orhem died. She was grateful when Theopin moved away and addressed the crowd. As Sabrina took Lindsey's hand in her own again, her friend turned to her.
"Sabrina, are you all right?"
"Yeah. Fine,"
she said. She had imagined Theopin a person, a prophet, even a saint, but one long dead. Not alive, not a leader. It made the rebellion startlingly real and dangerous. If a word on a wall could become real, what else could? Theopin's robe stopped short of his ankles. His sleeves were wide and drooped to reveal his sinewy arms as he raised his hands to the crowd and asked,
"Who speaks for these newcomers?"
Now the crowd was hushed. All eyes were on him. A few people stepped forward, calling out,
"I speak for Merle." "I speak for Peter."
I speak for Francis.
And the people on the stage smiled and hugged one another in relief before racing down to embrace those who had spoken for them. This was their way in, Sabrina realized. If someone knew you from one of the circles in the city, you were accepted. Relatives, neighbors, friends, acquaintances came forward to reclaim the other newcomers. 3 people claimed Lindsey. She burst into tears as other raid survivors came forth, running up the stairs to embrace her, their city clothes modified for the desert with scarves and belts holding canteens. Theopen and his assistants looked on, smiling, except for the sour man with the thick glasses and marble eyes. No one spoke for Sabrina. She was on the playground again, standing unpicked, without a friend. Alone. She fought a rising sense of panic while keeping her face as stony as possible, especially with the more militant-looking men staring at her. With all the joy over the new entrance, it took some time for the crowd to quiet and acknowledge that she alone remained on the stage. Aware of the silence, Lindsey looked up from the crowd and realized what was happening.
Theopen, this is my friend Sabrina. She is a cadet, but she saved me from my fate, breaking me out of prison. I claim her.
Theopen frowned, his lips crushed plums on a porcelain plate.
I am afraid a newcomer cannot speak for a fellow newcomer. Our rules are strict. Alas, I did not write them, and I do not claim the power to make an exception. I would lose what authority and trust I have. You understand, Sabrina?
What is to happen to me? Sabrina asked.
Visitors who are not known must be kept in confinement for a time,
said the man with the marble eyes. The hair on his head was mostly gone, revealing blue veins and a flaking red scalp. White residue was caked in the corners of his mouth. He rubbed his hands as he spoke, making a dry sound like withered husks moving together. He smelled stale and sweaty. Sabrina fought the urge to distance herself. 3 of the armed men, on some invisible signal from Marble Eyes, stepped toward the stairs, their bodies alive with the sound of jingling bullets, creaking leather, bandoliers, and heavy canteens. Lindsey came after them.
Then I must be too.
A matronly woman who had claimed Lindsey restrained her and said,
Lindsey, don't.
No!
Lindsey pulled herself free. She pushed between the men and reached the top of the steps to run across the stage to Sabrina's side.
We came together, and we will stay together. She is my best friend. I trust her, and I claim her,
she said, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath.
She's also a cadet,
Marble Eyes said.
How do we know her supervisors did not change? How do we know her supervisors did not stage for her to break you out as a perfect opportunity to reach us?
Lindsey paused and moved a braid off her cheek and forehead. It was clear she had never even considered the possibility.
No. She would not do that. She's sacrificed too much.
We cannot be too careful, Marble Eyes said. You both will be placed in the cages.
Cages. Sabrina took one look at the advancing guards and knew what would happen. Despite the kind of sentiments of Theopen and Lindsey's naivete, she knew these men. She may have been wrong about Bran, but she had never encountered someone like him before. As for these men, she had seen their kind at pitchball matches, their faces red with the exertion of screaming, eyes burning with illegal brew, fists clenched with barely repressed violence. She knew them from the alleyways, from the look in Orham's face as he stabbed Sean, then leapt to his own death. They were the others Grange had spoken of. Fanatics even Lindsey had bemoaned, and Sabrina knew that if she went to the cages, something would happen. Eventually, some accident, and she, and maybe Lindsey, for she could not escape their suspicion either, would not return. Her mind raced. She thought back to her training classes, a lecture on the beliefs of the occultists. You have to know your enemy to defeat your enemy, her instructors had told her. In the event of encounter, capture, or interrogation, officers were to try to manipulate believers, Theories, terminology, beliefs jumbled in her head as she reached for some course of action.
Wait. Let the master decide.
What? Marble Eyes asked, the guards stopping on either side of her and Lindsey.
If I am meant to be here,
Sabrina searched for the word,
His grace will be with me. If not, then his truth will prevail.
The occult speak was like filth in her mouth, but if it would save them, she would say anything. Lindsey looked bewildered. Grange and the others only less so. Sabrina lifted her chin and projected her best look of religious conviction.
Give me trial by ordeal.
And what ordeal would that be? Marble Eyes said. Sabrina swallowed a lump forming in her throat. Pinpricks of sweat broke out on her forehead.
Combat.
They made her wait in a chamber within the caverns while a ring was sanctified for the contest. The cave walls were covered in niter, and too close. She paced between them, although the constant turning made her dizzy. One of the guards outside had offered her a notebook that was filled with passages from religious texts, copied in a careful, exact hand. It was not unlike the notebook she had taken from the guard she had stunned at the factory. In any other place, she would have been filing it away as evidence. Not here. Here, she had made herself a part of the fantasy and had to play along. She knew she was expected to read the book, and she even flipped through some of the pages, but the passages were nonsense. Instead, she simply clutched it in her hands, the binding bending in her fist. My best attempt at devotion. Lindsey had gone silent since Theopen and the other elders had accepted the match terms. Now she sat outside the chamber, her hands balled under her chin, eyes staring out, unfocused. Sabrina had tried to comfort her, reminding her that Sean had trained her well. She had rarely lost a boxing match in the station gym. Grappling, as Pitt had shown her, would leave her vulnerable. But even a larger opponent here would not have had her training or experience. And if she lost, it would be a cage for her. She was certain of the outcome of that, if less certain wherever it would take place. There would be no one coming from the cities to claim her, no one from the underground circles to vouch for her. Only Lindsey. A few days, a few weeks. Poisoning. A fall. Depending on how long it had been since some of the more militant types had been with a woman, she knew what might come before the accident would be worse than death. But at least Lindsey would be free, and not on one of those terrible farms. In that sense, Sabrina felt a certain serenity. She had redeemed herself in that respect. Lindsey was safe. Lindsey sat up as Grange arrived. The hall was dimly lit by glow bars hung from the ceiling, their polymethylene cylinders bathing the walls in a pink-gold light. Despite the dark, the anger in Grange's face was clear. The guard stood aside and let Grange enter the chamber.
You make a mockery of us, Sabrina. Why?
She felt for the man who had shown her kindness, but she did not waver in her original conviction.
Grange, you know if I go into a cage, I'm not coming out.
He said nothing. He looked over his shoulder at Lindsey, whose expression of naive optimism was heartbreaking. He sighed.
I could station my men.
Sprocket? Denales? Bran? Your men seem far fewer than the muscle out there.
I have others.
I did not see them.
Sabrina, you don't know these people,
Lindsey pleaded.
But I do. I know those men. I've seen their kind before. You don't run a rebellion without muscle and authority. I've fought them in the streets, thrown them in cells. I go into those cages. I'm not coming out. That's fine for me. But I won't let that happen to you.
I'll go with you. We'll be safe.
I may have been wrong about Bran, but not these men.
Let me do this, please, Sabrina said. It's the only way you can be safe. And if I win, then, well, it's better for both of us. They will put you against a man.
Grange said. A man doesn't scare me. Sabrina turned to Lindsey, squeezing her shoulder. Hey, it will be all right. They say at the gym that I fight like I have 8 arms.
Then it'll be a true ordeal when you face 3 men, Theopen said, appearing in the passageway beside them, marble eyes trailing behind. She had heard someone in the caverns above refer to him as Dr. Rindle.
3?
Grange said, incredulous. We have conferred with the elders. A cadet is trained in hand-to-hand combat. 1, even 2 men might not pose a significant challenge, Theopen said, his hands outstretched as if cradling a fragile bowl between them.
That is preposterous,
Grange said. The elders prayed on it, Rindle said, closing his eyes, the lids large and pointed from the magnification of his glasses.
I am an elder. Why was I not consulted?
Grange asked, moving in close to Rindle, his chest expanding with the heat of confrontation. Rindle stepped back behind Theopen, but his voice was still firm. You brought the visitors in. It was decided that you would not be objective.
Theopen, are you going to stand for this?
Grange fumed. What is done. It is in the Master's hands now. I see our combatant has been contemplating his holy words, Theopen said, looking at the notebook in Sabrina's hands. But you do not strike me as a believer, cadet.
Maybe if I prevail, I will have reason to.
Theopen smiled. Careful, Cadet Sabria. I've heard too many lies in this life not to recognize one when I hear it. A genuine conversion would be powerful, only after a worthy ordeal. 3 men will ensure that.
Why not 4?
Sabrina said, the anger twisting inside, her face turning hot.
Done,
Rindle said, turning, his robes swirling about him as he turned to leave. That is a true ordeal. I will tell the elders.
Theopen, this is not the community we risked our lives to reach,
Lindsey shouted, pushing herself between the 2 men. Theopen inclined his head towards Lindsey, a hint of coldness in his voice. But it is a community saving your life right now. Do not presume to understand our ways so soon. You've only just arrived. As if conscious of his tone, he smiled and touched one of Lindsey's locks, a bell jingling as he did. What lovely adornments. You are a young woman of vitality and powerful belief. Your faith will see you through this. He released the lock of her hair and looked to Sabrina. I believe your friend's faith will see her through this too. I'm not a betting man, but if I were, I think I would bet on our cadet here. He left. Lindsey covered her face and ran down the passageway. Grange moved to follow her, but Sabrina pulled him back.
Grange, I'm sorry. My temper has always made things worse for me.
Sabrina apologized. Grange looked defeated.
And now worse for her as well. She loves you.
And I her.
Promise me you will look after her. With all my heart and my faith, the Master as my witness.
Thank you.
I'll see if I can make things any better with the elders,
he said before he left and disappeared into the darkness. They led Sabrina back into the main cavern without her suit. Even though it had no power source, the elders wanted to ensure she had no added advantage. She wore nothing but her running shorts and elastic bra. The air was cold on her skin, and she flexed and slapped her muscles to keep them warm. The cavern had been transformed since their arrival. The space for the match had been marked by oil lamps burning at 6 corners of a ring. The ground bore signs of having been recently swept, and bedrock showed underfoot. The children and teenagers were gone. The divide between the people Grange and Lindsey had described was unmistakable. Compassion, concern, disgust played on the faces of the believers gathered on one side of the ring. Denalius, Bran, and Sprocket stood among them, but even within those sympathetic faces, Sabrina wondered about enemies. How many would like to see a cadet imprisoned, or killed? How committed to peace were they? Sabrina was not ready to wager her life or Lindsey's on it, and it was difficult to read the wall of silent people,
who crossed their arms or held their hands beneath their chins. On the opposite side stood the soldiers. It was a carnival atmosphere as they cheered their champions and leered at Sabrina, their eyes lingering on her hips and breasts. Along with the cheers, the men would beat their canteens with their knives or hatchets. The clatter was so loud that Sabrina's ears rang. Dag's words, ritualized violence, echoed in her head. For a moment she pictured him kneeling in the discharge channel of the waterworks, his clothes dark with the water and sweat soaking him. Can't think of him now. He betrayed me. 4 men stood apart, shirtless and stretching. Sabrina sized them up as Dr. Rindle moved among them, slapping their flanks like a livestock auctioneer. She felt confident she could handle 1, even 2 at once. But 4? Dr. Rindle made a few substitutions to the fighter lineup, switching out a few men that were too thick around the middle for leaner ones. Denalis protested.
This is ridiculous. Let them be chosen at random.
He was immediately shouted down by the opposite side.
Do you not trust the master, Brother Denalis?
The youngest of the fighters, a blond man with short-cropped hair and a tattooed scalp, cried out. A delighted smile appeared on his face as the men cheered on his challenge.
The master could defeat 100 men, no matter the size.
A second fighter, a man with a jagged scar on his cheek, said. The soldiers responded with a chorus of beating knives and canteens. In a brief lull of the noise, someone called out for Sabrina to fight 100 men. The cry was taken up, the soldiers' bloodlust growing, until Theopen called for it to stop.
No. But let it be 5.
Cheers and boos, but the noise settled down. Sabrina did her best to maintain her resolve. She had learned long ago to wear it like a mask, even when she was withering inside. But she felt the mask slip, and her lips mouth a word of disbelief, betrayal even, when she saw the man who volunteered to be the 5th. Bran.
I have a quarrel with the cadet,
he announced.
She tried to kill me.
Theopen sat in a deep-seated chair on the dais, sunk so low into it that the folds of his robes gathered under his arms and around his shoulders in bunches.
Speak, brother.
Bran explained what had transpired at Willsbury's grave. Even the soldiers were silent. Lindsey tugged at her locks with her clenched fists, while Grange, Denalis, and Sprocket looked at Sabrina and Bran in confusion. Sabrina lowered her head so that her chin touched her chest. Bare, hard stone rested under her feet.
By your silence, I am to assume you do not protest?
Theopen asked.
Only to say it was a misunderstanding. I mistook his intentions. I thought we had made amends on the journey here.
Theopen's jaw shifted slightly while he stared at her before waving his hand.
5, then. The master will show us your true intentions unquestionably.
Grange stepped into the ring and tried to win over the crowd, speaking of love, compassion, and the true will of the master. Sabrina could see he had the support of many of the believers, the civilians, but they were neither as loud nor as intimidating, even if they were larger in number. Theopen allowed Grange to continue until the soldiers shouted him down and his voice was lost amongst the clamor. The match would take place. It had a life of its own now. Another elder, an old man whose robe seemed too big for his thin, hunched frame, entered the ring. In shaking, liver-spotted hands, he lifted a calabash of oil above his head, and the conversations and cheers broke off. Sabrina stared at it, mainly because she knew that if her eyes met Lindsey's, she would weep. Now was a time for steeliness. Her gaze drifted to the ceiling, where a tangle of wires and cables snaked between mismatched lights, the twisted looping lines, their lengths hung with dust, brought to mind the entrails of some beast, flung to the heavens in some obscene gesture to bloodthirsty gods. Here, in the belly of the beast. The elder prayed for the truth to emerge from the trial of combat. Most of his words were impossible to hear, as he mumbled into his hands folded about the calabash. When he was finished, he moved over to the fighters and anointed them. Blondie and Scar were first. Blondie's body was packed with muscle. His arms would give him a long reach in the ring, but Sabrina counted on him being inexperienced. Scar was older, as were the other two, one man whose torso was thick as a tree trunk, and another who only had one eye. What they lost in speed, they would make up for in cunning. The older men were all heftier. Their bulk would work against her, their bodies absorbing her blows like a finger flicking a horse. Then there was Bran. When she looked at him, she felt as if she had been punched in the belly. She marveled at how wrong she could have been about him, and whatever friendship they had developed. But self-doubt was self-defeating. She shook her head and stretched out her arms and legs. She had never won a fight by force. Against a man, anyway. Sean had coached her long ago that her strategy had to be to outlast her male opponents. They would underestimate her, and when the fight would last longer than the men had anticipated, they would grow tired. Fatigue, frustration, and wounded pride would work against them as much as punches. They would make a mistake. Then she would strike. But 5 men. 5 would wear her down. Grappling would be a lost cause. She could not remain engaged with any one fighter for more than 2 strikes, at best, and with one of those 2 strikes likely being a feint or a block. Each one had to count. Quick, precise. She would have to be effective immediately, because her own fatigue would take its toll on her before them. With shirts removed, tattoos of moons and suns orbited the torsos of her opponents, while inked sword hilts hung above their navels, the blades sinking downward into their pants. Gone were the pieties of the welcome ceremony. This was a transformed place. Theopen seemed to be presiding over something wholly different now. The elder anointed each fighter 3 times, tracing a sun, a moon, and a sword over their head, hearts, and shoulders respectively. A few men, including Bran, offered their fists to be anointed with the sword as well. Finished, the elder was disappearing beyond the smoking oil lamps into the crowd when Sabrina had an idea and asked to be anointed as well.
"I have not given up on you yet, Lindsey."
The elder kept at bay, his hands clasped around the calabash, his eyes searching Grange, Dr. Rindle, then Theopen. With another flick of the wrist, Theopen signaled for the elder to comply, saying, "If it is to be a sanctified match, let her be anointed as well." The elder approached, hesitantly mumbling some cult speech about the way of the moon bringing wisdom, the sun bringing holy fire, and the sword righteousness. As he reached for her shoulder, Sabrina swept the calabash from his hands and shoved him backwards. He was light and frail and tumbled over, tripping on his robe. If only her opponents would be so easily bested. Before he could recover, she removed the stopper and poured the oil out onto her shoulders, breasts, back, and legs, tossing aside the empty vessel and spreading the slippery liquid all over her body. Occultists cried out red-faced, protesting her blasphemy, but Theopen silenced them. "She desires his grace. Be that he is as generous with her as the oil she spills. Now, start the match." The elder hastened to make a quick retreat while Sabrina's opponents stalked into the ring, Blondie, Scar, and Tree Trunk leading the way, Bran and One Eye bringing up the rear. Her hope that it would be a tag-in match with her facing one at a time evaporated. It would be a brawl, just as she expected. With so many opponents, she realized that in close quarters, they would get in one another's way. At best, she might be fighting 3 at a time, but that was still too many. She knew what she needed. They had to be scattered. She danced around the ring, moving just out of their reach. They were being cautious, testing her reflexes and speed with feints and half-hearted swings. Blondie was proving impulsive, coming in close more often than the others. Scar and Tree Trunk waited eagerly behind him, spoiling for a fight, while One Eye and Bran hung back, studying her. Those 2 will be dangerous. The crowd was becoming impatient. One spectator shoved her back into the ring when she danced close to the edge to avoid one of Blondie's strikes. She nearly tripped over one of the oil lamps. Stumbling, she distanced herself from the flames, lest the oil doused on her ignite. She struggled to remain patient, waiting for a formation to her liking. With a duck and a feint, she dodged one of Tree Trunk's attempts to grab her around the waist. The men now spread out in a row across the ring, Scar, Blondie, Tree Trunk, Bran, One Eye. It was time. She attacked not the center but the flank, choosing Blondie as her target. She closed the distance, leapt, and landed with both feet on his chest. He was solid, but not as thick as the others. His inexperience had not prepared him for such an assault. As he fell backwards, he tried to grab her, but she kicked one oily ankle free, then smashed his face with the heel of her boot. He let out a sickening, whistling wheeze, and a warm spray of spit and blood spattered on her bare leg. Scar was separated now from the pack, and she caught him with a heel of her palm under his nose, hoping to break it, but if nothing else, momentarily blind him with tears and blood. She pirouetted and kicked backwards, aware that Tree Trunk was just behind her. She struck him in the abdomen, but his size and momentum sent her tripping forward. She turned as he closed in, arms outstretched. It was easy to stop him with a kick to the groin, and as he bent over, she broke his collarbone with a right hammer strike, feeling the slender bone pop beneath her fist and noting with satisfaction how the two pieces moved out of alignment as he fell to his knees. She threw a punch at his nose for good measure, but he turned his head so she struck his ear. It was one strike too many. One Eye slammed into her, tackling her to the ground, pinning her with his weight and raining blows down on her face. Lights flashed in her vision. Geometric shapes and colors appeared even behind closed eyes as her skull rang with a high-pitched buzzing that drowned out everything else. She tasted blood. This was the end. There was no escaping from this position. Her moments of ascendancy were past. The inevitable advantage of numbers settling down on her with all the weight of the man atop her. As she resigned herself to defeat, a certain peace settled over her. A peace she knew she had been seeking all along. She had arrested her own friend, placed her in danger, and for that, she deserved what was coming. She knew she had lost Lindsey long ago to these people, and the best she could do to right the wrongs, to give Lindsey a second chance, was to simply give up and hope one of the blows would be fatal. But two strong hands pulled her out from under One Eye, roughly yanking her by the armpits. It was Bran. He had not had an opportunity to contribute his measure of suffering upon her yet. He pinched her arms painfully behind her back and swung her out limply, helplessly to the others. A string of her blood leaked down to the floor from her lips. She could not even muster the breath to spit. The crowd of soldiers was a wall of shaking fists, open mouths, red, wet holes of darkness waiting to devour her. So it was to last that much longer. Bran would see to that. Tree Trunk was off to the side, holding his collarbone. Blondie was on all fours, wheezing, mucus and blood strung from his face to the floor. But Scar had wiped the blood from his eyes, spreading it over his face, a bloody red mask. One Eye was getting up, panting from the exertions of beating her, his knuckles red with their blood. The sword tattoo rising from his groin like some hideous deformed phallus. He was closer and reached her before Scar, backhanding her across the face, turning to his side of the crowd for their approval, which they returned in a unified voice that boomed off the cavern walls. Sabrina wanted to look for Lindsey, but her vision was filled with the sight of the man before her, and her head was spinning out of control. She wanted this to be over. That would be less painful on her friend. If she could just hear her voice once more and take that with her. She tried to listen for Lindsey, but instead heard Bran's voice speaking into her ear, his breath warm on her skin.
"Come on, girl, fight! You've got it in you!"
He was taunting her, humiliating her. He was so close his pelvis was up against her, perhaps threatening her with worse violations that were to come. He ground his pelvic bone into her backside, moving her in a way that made some of the closer onlookers hoot with laughter. His mouth was close to her ear again. "I've got your back." One Eye was turning to her again for a second slap, just as something surged through her, some understanding that she still had a chance, that she and Lindsey, their friendship, had life in it still. She slipped her arm easily out of Bran's loosened grip, wrapped it around his shoulder, and shifted her foot. His body was close to her, too close. It took little effort for her to bend at the waist, ram her hip into him, and shift his center of gravity. She flung him over her shoulder into One Eye, their bodies colliding with a loud meat-on-meat slap. They both tumbled, Bran landing atop One Eye, giving her time. Tree Trunk backed out of the ring, his arms useless. He was out. Blondie was recovering slowly, but a kick to his face sent him reeling and silenced the crowd. She turned to Scar, her limbs trembling. He had learned his lesson and was keeping his distance. She had him one-on-one, while One Eye was trying to extricate himself from beneath Bran, who was moving slowly, holding his shoulder as if injured. Sabrina did not want her advantage to slip away, but Scar was proving to be cagey, moving and dodging her, stalling until the others could join him, and he could press the advantage of numbers. She moved in close, distracting him with blows to the face before she swept his legs out from beneath him. He did not go down easily, grabbing her by her shorts as he fell. She lost her footing and crashed down beside him, his hand twisting the material around her waist and pulling her toward him. One of the oil lamps was burning just beside her. She grabbed its neck and swung it into his face. The clay shattered and the oil blazed. She rolled away to avoid catching fire herself. Scar slapped at his face before spectators intervened, throwing a cloak over his face and putting out the flames. His beard was singed and smoking, his eyes full of fury. Sabrina charged and worked her feet up for a jump, but he had seen this trick and dodged left. She anticipated it, sidestepped, skidded, and threw herself onto the earthen floor. She spun one knee and extended the opposite leg, striking him in the back of his knee, buckling the leg. When he fell, she was upon him like a wild animal, taking his hand and twisting the palm while straddling his prone body. His arm pressed against her groin, and she used her legs to twist until the arm jerked out of its shoulder socket, the crowd gasping in unison at the popping noise. One Eye plowed into her from behind, lifting her and carrying her towards the stage where Theopen sat watching, motionless, but for his eyes darting between his narrowed lids. The crowd was thinnest here, and cleared immediately, leaving nothing but the timber of the stage. A woman screamed as Sabrina collided with it, then she realized that the stranger's cry was her own. The air was quickly gone from her lungs as One Eye slammed her into the wood repeatedly. She was in the classroom, Pitt throwing her against a desk all over again. But the effort was costing her opponent. He stepped back for another run into her, pausing to catch his breath, trying to hold her in place with one arm. She writhed against his strength. The oil helped. He strained to keep her in place, the tendons rising in his neck, but she freed one arm, then the other, and thrust her thumb into his eye socket. Muscle and sinew and skin fought her as she pressed, and he squinted, but her fingers would win. Her thumbnail was already sinking into his left eyeball. He dropped her and fell back. She had to catch her breath before she kicked him in the pommel of his sword tattoo, where his lowest ribs met. He doubled over and she snatched one of his hands as he did so, twisting it and him into the floor where she raked his face with her nails.
Please, not my eye! I yield!
She released him, but then her right leg exploded with pain. Her knee buckled and she hit her head on the bedrock floor. The room spun. She wondered if a sixth fighter had joined. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a shock of blonde hair.
Blondie.
She tried to scramble up, but it was more of a stumble, the leg he struck refusing to move the way she wanted. She was seeing double. Blondie's face was red and misshapen. She had knocked out one of his teeth. He had ripped off a piece of the stage, a wooden plank that he swung like a club. Spectators booed and protested. Even some of the soldiers seemed to disapprove. Sabrina looked to Theopen to intervene, but he watched without expression. Sabrina continued to pedal backwards, trying to shake the pain out of her leg and blink away her double vision. She did her best to avoid Bran as well, who she could tell was trying to formulate some response to help her without exposing their alliance. No time. Blondie charged in again, swinging the board at her head. She ducked, nearly tumbling over as she shifted her weight to her injured leg. Blondie overextended, the board going wide and nearly striking a spectator. He righted himself, but the crowd had turned against him. His near victim began to quarrel with him. Blondie turned his back on Sabrina. She took advantage of the opening, limping up behind him and snatching the board from his hand as he reared back with it, intimidating one of the believers. His eyes registered surprise the instant before she broke the board across his face. As he fell, she could see civilians, even a few soldiers cheering for her, their eyes wide, their hands balled into fists. For an instant, she was transported back to Carnap Avenue, rosemary and aniseed scenting the air lit gold by the setting sun. Sean stood before her, smiling, while a gaggle of boys ran after a pitch ball, and their mothers clapped for Sabrina, her cheeks suddenly flush with heat, her armpits itching with moisture.
I can't be responsible for all their hopes and dreams.
But you are.
The cheers lessened. Bran was upon her now, tackling and wrestling her to the ground. She screamed as his weight fell on her injured leg, a knot of pain exploding above her knee and shooting up her thigh. She pulled free and stood her ground. Bran charged again, but he made it easy. He stumbled and swung wide. Sabrina encircled his waist, carried his arm over his shoulder, and flung him down to the ground. Stars streaked across her vision, a curtain of darkness descending on the periphery. She knew she would never have completed this maneuver if he had not been a willing victim. With his arm locked, she flipped him on his side, collapsed to her knees, then all the way to her shoulder and wrapped his neck in her thighs. It was difficult to hold him there, as slippery as she was with sweat and oil and her muscles burning and shaking with exhaustion. But he only made a token effort to resist, convincing enough of those watching before she squeezed. His face turned a deep maroon, and his whiskers tickled her skin. She was not sure if he tapped out before he lost consciousness, but abruptly he stiffened, and just as quickly went limp and motionless between her legs. She released him and lay there for what felt like a long while, staring up at the mess of electronics and lighting on the cavern's ceiling. Gradually, her breathing slowed, and Bran stirred next to her. She became aware of Lindsey's face looking down at her, wearing an expression of relief mixed with awe, and the unmistakable flush of victory. A smile appeared amid the tears, and Sabrina felt herself laugh, her fear vanishing. Meanwhile, a towering figure stood over them, hands out to his side, facing down a number of shouting men.
She won fair, boys,
Denalis said, his fingers spreading wide before he curled them into fists the size of demolition hammers. The angry losers were soon crowded out by the onlookers who had been against the spectacle in the first place. Kind-faced men and women moved in around them, forming a protective circle. In stature, they were all smaller than the fierce men, but there was a firm resolution in their eyes, a cold determination of their own. Theopen rose from his chair.
Enough! We have our answer. Providence is on her side. We will accept her with full rights of any other member.
It was nothing like a fight now. Theopen stood tall, commanding, solemn. He made a sign over his body that others copied. Still others kneeled and prayed while they made the same gesture over their bodies. Theopen was speaking up to the ceiling, his eyes closed. Denalis picked up Sabrina, his hand gently smoothing her hair, while Grange and Sprocket attended to Bran.
Did I hear Theopen say we just witnessed a miracle?
Sabrina asked Denalis, her head against his chest, her words thick around her bruised and bloody lips.
Aye, and I think we did,
Denalis said, smiling.
It would take nothing short of a miracle to get Bran's ugly face between your thighs.